Hi, everyone. Welcome. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Thank you for joining us for the second workshop in this series all about OET. So today's session is all about OET reading. Last week we focused on listening. So in this session, we'll get to know OET reading, then review 3 key reading skills. I'll guide you through some careful reading of a passage. I'll share some tips and tools to improve reading, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end for questions and answers. Okay. So let's start with the basics of OET reading. There are 3 parts to OET. Okay. A, B, and C for OET reading. It takes around 60 minutes, and there are 3 different text types you need to see. In part A, which is an expeditious or fast reading task, you will work with point of care texts. These might be dosage chart, care plans, medication tables, texts you might refer to when treating a patient or client. There are 20 questions in part A. In part B, you see 6 short extracts from workplace texts, perhaps an email from a manager or a policy document or guidelines, with 1 question per text. And in part C, there are 2 long passages similar to journal articles or texts you would read as part of your professional development as a healthcare professional. Each text has 8 questions each. In terms of timing, as you can see, there's 15 minutes for part A and 45 minutes for parts B and C combined. And those differences in the time that each section takes and the text and question type really matter when it comes to the reading skill you use in each section. We're going to focus on 3 reading skills that you probably hear about often, and you need to use these 3 skills in the test, but you use them at different points, and one of them might be a little unexpected. The 3 reading skills for OET reading, and indeed for most reading, are skimming, scanning, and careful reading. Now, what do these words actually mean? What is skimming and scanning? How are they different from careful reading? In this session, we'll take a closer look at these different skills. Right. As you can see here, skimming and scanning are more useful for part A, and careful reading is more useful for parts B and C. Let's start with the basics of, well, actually, yes, of OET reading part A. Okay, we're going to take a closer look at this. In this part of the test, you'll read medication tables, dosage charts, instructions, treatment pathways, diagnostic tools. At least one may have info in a visual format. Okay, and then you can see the basics of part A on the slide, 15 minutes for short point of care texts, 20 questions, and it's really testing your ability to skim and scan, locate information, and record information accurately. In the real test, you have 15 minutes, as I mentioned before. Today, though, we'll only be doing 6 different types of questions. 6 different questions total. And of those 6 questions, we'll be breaking it into 3 different types of questions, okay? So let's go ahead and take a look at this now. If you're taking OET on computer, your text will be on the left and the questions on the right, and you can scroll up and down and zoom in if you need to. You can also use a highlighter function. Remember, we only have 15 minutes, so we have to be really smart about how we use our time in part A. The strategy we suggest is to skim first. I'll show you how, and then answer the questions in order. Skimming first will help you find the answers to the first set of questions quickly and easily. Then you can focus on the other questions. So, how do you skim? Before we look at how to skim, tell me, why do you skim? All right, why is it important? You skim text every day in real life. Next time you notice yourself looking at something to understand just the main points, how it's organized, or the purpose of a text, know that you are using the skill of skimming. So, how do we skim? There are a couple different ways to do so. Okay, so first, it's important to read the titles, headings, and subheadings. Next, take a look at any tables or chart labels. Read the start of bullet points and lists. Read the first sentence of different paragraphs. And lastly, notice any content words or other words that you see repeated throughout the texts. Explain that, what I'm going to do now on this slide is show you a text on the screen and give you a 20-second timer. What you should do is skim by reading only the yellow highlighted parts of the text as quickly as you can. Okay, so you have 20 seconds to quickly skim by reading only the highlighted text. All right, let's look at text A. I'm going to give you the 20 seconds now. Read the highlighted parts. Part B, take 20 seconds to read the highlighted parts. Part C. And part D. Okay. So, and just as a reminder, the different ways of how we skim, I have the answers here. You're reading the titles and headings, table and chart labels, the start of bulleted points, the first sentence of paragraphs, and those content words and repeated words. All right, so I'm going to show you instructions and a question on the next slide. You will then decide which text to look at and zoom in to find the answers. Okay, now you won't be able to read all 4 texts on the screen at once, but that's okay because it's not necessary to do so. That's just for us to decide which text to zoom in closer on. All right, so the first questions in reading A are called matching questions. Here are the instructions. For each question, 1 to 6, decide which text, A, B, C, or D, the information comes from. Write the letter in the space provided. You may use any letter more than once. Okay? The skimming we just did will be really helpful here. Sometimes you can answer a question without reading more, just from your skimming and the text headings. I'll show you the text headings and a super small image of each one, and we will zoom in when we need to. Okay, so let's start out with question 1. Okay, so we have what patients should, in which text can you find information about what patients should and shouldn't do when they return home? Okay, and here's kind of some of the main pieces here. Should, shouldn't do, return home. Those are kind of the main, their most important part of this question. I'm looking for a text that tells me what patients should and shouldn't do when they are discharged. Okay, so which text do you think has that information? And remember the skimming that we already did. So which text would you look at to find this information for question number 1? A, B, C, or D? All right, I see a couple people saying letter D. So let's go ahead and see what we have next. Yeah, text D is most likely placed because it was all about advice for patients with head injury. Does this text have information about what a patient should and shouldn't do when they go home? Yes, it does. It covers things like not driving home, not being left alone, not having alcohol. So this is definitely the right answer here, the right text. We put the answer D in the space here as our answer. Notice we do not write text D or any extra information. We just write the letter D. Let's move on to our next question. In which text can you find information about the possible cause of abnormality apparent in a patient's eyes? What are the important words here, right? I think cause abnormality and patient's eyes are the key words here. So where would you find this information? Did you read anything about eyes, or can the headings of these texts help you? Which text do we think we would look at here? All right, I see a couple of answers. Let's go ahead and take a look here. We're probably going to find the answer in one of these two texts, A or B. Okay, so let's zoom in first on text A. Can you see anything related to eyes here? Let's take a closer look. Related to eyes. Here's information about an abnormality in the eye. One pupil becomes dilated, becomes fixed and dilated. And the cause, it may indicate expanding intracranial hemorrhage. So that's how we tackle the questions here, these matching questions. We start by skimming. We look at each question and think about which text you expect or you saw that information in. Then do a quick check like we just did. You don't need to read carefully, just check that, yes, this text has the information that I'm looking for. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to another type of question. For these sentence completion questions, here we have the instructions. Complete each of the sentences with a word or short phrase from one of the texts. Each answer may include words, numbers, or both. Okay, so here we have our text again. So for our first one, number 7, a patient presenting with an blank must be referred straight to the medical officer as an emergency case. So based on the text around the blank here, what can you guess about the answer that we're looking for in the text? First, we have the word presenting with. So this means the answer is probably a type of condition, presenting with X. Okay, presenting with, it means it's probably a condition. And we have the word "an." So the answer will likely start with a vowel and be singular because we have the word "and" there, not "a" or "the." Also, it says medical officer, an emergency case. So we know this is probably a pretty serious condition, okay? So here are our 4 texts. Where should we look for the answer here? What number, what letter rather do we think? A, B, C, or D? Okay. So these two deal with pain management in primary care and evaluation. So I'd expect the answer to be here in one of these two. Let's take a look at text A. Can you find anything here about referring to the MO as an emergency case? It does mention notify medical officer immediately if blood pressure or level of consciousness alter. And further down it says consult medical officer immediately if you notice rapid deteriorating in GCS or changes in pupils. Because we can assume it's an emergency, we might be able to assume that's an emergency, although it doesn't specifically say so. And there's nothing here that can go into the gap following a patient presenting with "an." So let's take a look at text B and see what we find there. We're looking for MO referral when a patient presents. So we're probably looking at the top of this flow chart. We see MO mentioned here. Under open head injury, the text says, consult MO immediately to arrange transfer to intensive care. This is the patient presenting with a particular condition. The instructions are to consult MO for transfer to ICU, so it's definitely an emergency. So what do we think the answer would be here? What do you think the answer is? All right, the answer is open head injury. All right, open head injury. So now let's go on to our final type of question, short answer questions. Here we follow that same strategy as in sentence completion. All right, you can answer each of the question with a word or short phrase from one of the texts. Each answer may include words, numbers, or both. And you should not write full sentences here, not necessary to write full sentences. All right, so what are kind of some of the key words here? If there are no significant risk factors, how long after a head injury can you discharge a patient? So it's asking for the amount of time, how long? The condition is that there should be no other significant risk factors present. So we are looking for a time related to discharge. Where do you think we could find this information? A, B, C, or D? Okay, so I would expect the answer to be in either B or D. Text B is a treatment pathway that tells us what to do with a patient with a head injury. So I'm looking here first. Using our knowledge from a previous question, we know that open head injury patients are transferred to intensive care. So we're looking at what happens in case of closed head injuries. If there are no risk factors at all, we can see here, this box relates to discharge advice. The patient can be just discharged after 6 hours if observations remain in the normal range. So we can see that our answer would be 6 hours in this case, right? How long? With no other significant risk factors, can they be discharged after how long? After 6 hours. So our answer would be 6 hours. Here's an easy way to remember some tips based on what we did for reading part A. Quickly skim first, use text headings to guide you. In order, do questions one by one. Choose an answer for every question, no blanks, and keep moving. Skip and come back if stuck on a specific question. Now let's move on to reading part B. So reading part B are 6 short texts that you might read in the workplace. 1 3-option multiple choice question, 1 3-option multiple choice per question, and assessing the ability to read for main ideas, detail, and purpose. Let's do one question together, focusing on reading carefully. We'll start with a question, okay? So it says, according to the announcement, the main purpose of the course is to. So what do you think the most important words here on this question? So I think it would be main purpose here, right? Main purpose. So we're going to read step by step very carefully, very differently to what we did in part A. As we read, we're asking ourselves all the time, what's the main purpose of the course? Okay, the main purpose is what we're focusing on. So, okay, I'm going to go ahead and bring the text up here and give you some time to read the text, okay? So go ahead, take about 30, 40 seconds to read this text. And then I want you to think about what the answer might be in your own words. How would you answer this in your own words? And then we'll see the answer option. So take about 1 minute to read the text and write in the chat how you would answer this in your own words. All right, so now that we've thought about the answer, answered your own words, let's go ahead and take a look at the answer options. Okay, and again, main purpose. So now that we have the answer options, what do you think the answer would be? A, B, or C? A, B, or C? All right, so the answer here, as you guys wrote, is letter B. Ensure that participants have up-to-date knowledge on the topic. And these highlighted sections stood out as speaking about the purpose of the course. It was aimed to help nurses extend their understanding of the topic and gain latest best practice guidelines. A little later in the paragraph, it says that they should have completed foundational training, and the course was intended as a refresher course, which is to keep their knowledge fresh and current. So now let's move on to reading part C. Right, here we are. So for reading part C, we have two texts around 800 words. These are similar to journal or review articles, 8 questions per text, and it's testing the ability to read for main points, detail, attitude or opinion, and vocabulary in context. Imagine that you're in the test, the clock is ticking, and you have 800 word text to read and 8 questions. What do you think that you would do, right? Well, how do we get started here? By the way, notice that each question tells you where to find the answer, right? So it says first paragraph, second paragraph. This is true of most Part C questions. They tell you where to find the answer, and usually there is one question or two per paragraph. So you don't need to go backwards in the text. You're going to keep moving forward. Also, for this type of question, the word or phrase is bolded and underlined in both the question and the text. Okay, so let's look at 2 strategy options for Part C. The first is QOT. Read the question first, then the options, then the text. That's one option. The second is QTO. Question first, then text, then options. Okay, and we tried this in reading part B. So what strategy do you think is best, right? If you think about that for a second, well, the answer here is that it's probably a good idea to practice both and find out which option works best for you, okay? Which option works best for you. So let's start out with QTO. All right, so starting out with the question. In the first paragraph, what point is made about patients who have perceived bad news? Okay, patients who have received bad news. All right, then we have our text here. So I'm going to leave this on the screen for you. Take about 30 seconds to read this. And again, in your own words, write what you think the answer is. Take about 1 minute to do all of that. Read the text, write what you think the answer is. All right. So let's go ahead and take a look at the answer options. Go ahead and take some time to read and write what you think the best answer is in the chat. A, B, C, or D. All right, so the answer here is letter B, right? We can see it says much has been published about patients' reactions. So their responses have been extensively explored, is what we can see the answer here for question 7, letter B. Now let's use the other strategy. This time we'll read the question, then the options, then the text. So let's start out with a question. It's asking us what the writer is doing in the second paragraph. So here we have our options: describing a means of solving a problem, justifying a suggestion which has been made, explaining the reason for a common occurrence, or giving an example of something already mentioned. Okay, so go ahead and read the text now and choose your answer. So take about 1 minute to do that, starting now. All right, so our answer here we can see is letter C, explaining the reason for a common occurrence. Okay, and then we have some parts of the text that I'm highlighting here, right? It says, phenomenon of identifying the bad news with the bearer of it isn't unique to our profession. And then it has this other piece at the bottom as well, right? So that's the reasoning behind why we chose letter C. Notice how all parts of the question have to be, all parts of the answer have to be given in order for it to be correct, right? So we have to make sure that all parts are given for it to be correct, for letter C to be the correct answer. All right, so before we finish off with some final resources and things like that, you can download this reading test, this mini reading test from our website to complete the tasks from today's workshop. So if you want to take another read through the text, if you want to answer some questions, you can do so by downloading this from our website. So feel free to take a screenshot or picture of this link so you can access that later, okay? Let's talk now about developing your reading skills for OET and beyond. On the OET website, available at OET.com, we have 5 free sample tests available. You can print them out or try the computer version if you're taking OET on computer. We've also got a guided practice video and some practice tests available in the OET store in practice tests. If you'd like more guidance, we have the OET Reading Skills course. This is online and self-directed. Learn the skills and strategies for OET reading with videos, activities, and sample tasks. Some non-OET resources we recommend are the website breakingnewsenglish.com. Here you can find texts on different topics and levels of difficulty. They are ready-made lessons and activities to test your reading, vocab, and grammar skills, including some tools to practice speed reading. Finally, medical journals and publications are, of course, great ways to practice your reading skills. TheConversation.com is an online newspaper with articles similar to those in Reading Part C, with differing options and expert insights. Finally, some tips to build your reading skills. When it comes to success in OET reading, make sure you're using the right skill at the right time. Skim and scan in part A, but work on careful reading in parts B and C. Whenever you read, read with purpose. In the text, your purpose is to answer each question. When you're preparing, you might be reading to get an overall idea or to learn something new. Read actively. This can mean highlighting or underlining as you read, but it also means mentally. Visualize what you're reading as you go. Imagine the people and the situation. Predict what's coming next. Ask yourself questions as you read. In terms of preparing for your test, I've mentioned some useful online tools. Spend some time getting familiar with them and using them daily. You cannot improve reading if you don't actually read. Once your test is done, you can quit, but right now you need to dedicate time to doing this. Work also on building language and grammar because these have a significant impact on your reading ability. And lastly, build stamina. OET reading is 1 hour and it follows a 40-minute listening test. So you need to have energy to manage the text and questions. Make sure you practice reading for long stretches of time without distraction. Again, you can give this up after the test, but doing so now will benefit you. All right, here's our social media page. Feel free to follow us if you don't already. Next is we have our writing workshop next week, followed by a speaking workshop, which will be the final one. Okay. So I'd now like to turn it over for you for any questions you might have. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if there's any questions about OET reading, about anything we covered today. Any questions? Okay, great. Well, if we don't have any questions, then thank you so much for your time and for your participation in this session. Please do join us next week for the writing workshop, and then the following week, the final week for the speaking workshop. Okay, all these are great for you that are if you're preparing or will soon be taking OET. Okay, so everyone have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you next week for our next session. Thank you.